The encounter. The ship's alarms blared, red lights flashing in every corner of the cockpit. Daniel struggled with the controls, sweat dripping down his face as he desperately tried to stabilize his descent. The planet below loomed larger by the second, a world covered in dense forests, jagged mountains, and swirling clouds. He had no choice but to crash land. The impact was hard, throwing him against his seat as the ship skidded across rocky terrain and slammed into a grove of towering trees. When the dust settled, silence filled the air. Daniel groaned, unstrapped himself, and stumbled out of the wreckage, coughing as smoke rose from the damaged engine. The air was heavy and humid, carrying the unfamiliar scent of alien flora. Strange, luminous plants glowed faintly around him, casting eerie shadows. His eyes scanned the area, searching for any signs of danger. He was a survivor, a scavenger who had explored countless planets, but this place felt different. It wasn't the kind of world that welcomed visitors. A low growl rumbled behind him. Daniel froze. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as a chill ran down his spine. Slowly, he turned around, clutching a metal rod he'd grabbed from the ship. His heart pounded as his eyes met the source of the sound. It was massive, at least 3 times his height. The alien giantess stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the shadows of the forest. Her skin was a pale, shimmering gray, like moonlight on water, and her eyes glowed faintly blue. Long, silver hair flowed down her back, and her sharp teeth gleamed as she studied him, with an expression that was somewhere between curiosity and hunger. Daniel's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He felt like a mouse caught in the gaze of a hawk. The giantess took a slow, deliberate step forward, her bare feet making the ground tremble. Her presence was overwhelming, a mix of raw power and primal grace. "Stay back," Daniel shouted, raising the rod in a futile attempt to defend himself. His voice cracked, betraying his fear. The giantess tilted her head, her glowing eyes narrowing as if trying to understand his words. Her lips parted, and she let out a low, melodic sound, a language Daniel couldn't recognize. The sound was strange yet oddly soothing, like a song carried by the wind. But her movements were far from gentle. She reached out a hand, her massive fingers stretching toward him. "No, no, no," Daniel muttered under his breath, backing away until his back hit the smoldering hull of his ship. He was trapped. His grip tightened on the rod, though he knew it wouldn't make a difference. The giantess crouched down, her face now level with his. Up close, he could see the intricate patterns on her skin, like natural tattoos etched by time. Her eyes, though intense, held no malice. She sniffed the air around him, her expression shifting from curiosity to amusement. Was she smiling? Daniel's mind raced. Was she planning to toy with him before finishing him off? He couldn't tell. But then, something unexpected happened. Instead of attacking, she spoke again, her tone soft and almost gentle. She gestured toward the glowing plants nearby, then pointed at him, as if trying to communicate something. "What do you want?" Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. He lowered the rod slightly, unsure of what to make of her behavior. The giantess didn't respond, at least not in words. Instead, she extended her hand again, palm open. It was a gesture he recognized, an invitation, not a threat. Her glowing eyes locked onto his, waiting. Daniel hesitated. Was this a trap, or was she genuinely trying to help? His survival instincts screamed at him to run, but a quieter voice in his mind urged him to take the chance. He had seen enough of the universe to know that not all creatures were what they seemed. Taking a deep breath, Daniel cautiously placed the rod down and reached out. His hand was tiny compared to hers, but as their skin touched, a strange warmth spread through him. The giantess's eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected him to accept. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the tension hanging in the air. Then, with surprising care, she closed her hand around his and lifted him off the ground. Daniel tensed, but she cradled him in her massive palm, holding him like a fragile bird. She stood to her full height, carrying him away from the wreckage and into the forest. Daniel's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. What was she planning? Why hadn't she harmed him? And where was she taking him? As the dense forest swallowed them, Daniel realized one thing. He was completely at her mercy. Whatever her intentions were, his fate was now tied to this mysterious giantess. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he'd survive. Unexpected hospitality. The first thing Daniel noticed as he woke was the absence of pain. He blinked groggily, staring up at the high ceiling of a cavern glowing softly with bioluminescent plants. His body felt strangely refreshed, his usual aches from years of scavenging gone. Sitting up, he quickly realized he wasn't alone. The giantess was there, sitting cross-legged near the entrance of the cave. Her massive frame blocked the light filtering in from outside, casting her in silhouette. Her back was to him as she focused on something in her hands. Daniel's breath caught as he realized she was crafting, her enormous fingers weaving together vines and crystal shards into what looked like a weapon. It was almost peaceful until she turned her head and met his gaze. Her glowing eyes narrowed slightly, and Daniel's instincts screamed at him to run. But before he could scramble to his feet, she let out a soft, melodic sound, a hum that resonated through the cave. It wasn't threatening. If anything, it felt calming. "Okay," Daniel muttered under his breath, forcing himself to stay still. No sudden moves. The giantess tilted her head, as if amused by his caution, and pointed to a pile of glowing fruit on a nearby rock. The gesture was unmistakable. She wanted him to eat. Daniel's stomach growled, betraying him. But he hesitated. The glowing fruit didn't look particularly safe, bright purple with swirling patterns that seemed alive. He'd seen enough alien plants in his travels to know that the prettier they were, the more likely they were poisonous. Yet the giantess reached over, picked up one of the fruits, and took a deliberate bite. She chewed slowly, then pointed at him again, her expression almost impatient. "Right," he said, grabbing one hesitantly. "If I drop dead, I'm blaming you." Taking a small bite, he braced for the worst. Instead, a wave of warmth spread through his body, as if he'd drunk a cup of hot tea on a freezing day. His exhaustion melted away, replaced by a strange clarity. The fruit wasn't just edible, it was energizing. "Whoa," he whispered, taking another bite. This is amazing." The giantess let out a low rumble, a sound that Daniel interpreted as approval. She returned to her crafting, occasionally glancing his way to ensure he wasn't doing anything reckless. It struck him as odd. Why would a creature so much larger and stronger than him bother with kindness? Was she planning to fatten him up for some gruesome alien ritual? As he ate, Daniel began observing his surroundings more closely. The cavern wasn't just a random shelter, it was lived in. Tools, woven mats, and even crude carvings lined the walls. This wasn't the lair of a mindless predator. Whoever, or whatever, this giantess was, she had intelligence. She had a life. When she finished her crafting, the giantess stood and approached him, holding out the newly made spear. Daniel froze, unsure of her intentions, but she simply placed it on the ground between them. Her glowing eyes seemed to study him, searching for something he couldn't understand. "Is this for me?" he asked, gesturing to the spear. She nodded, then motioned to the cave entrance. Her expression turned serious as she pointed into the dense forest beyond. Daniel didn't need a translator to grasp the meaning. Danger, she was warning him. "Great," he muttered, because crash landing wasn't enough of a nightmare. The giantess crouched down, drawing symbols in the dirt with her clawed finger. Daniel leaned closer, trying to make sense of it. The symbols were crude but clear, a pack of creatures with glowing eyes, sharp claws, and twisted forms. They were hunting. Daniel's stomach dropped. He'd seen strange shadows in the forest before he was brought here. Now he knew he hadn't imagined them. The giantess let out another low hum, her gaze locking onto his. She tapped her chest, then pointed to him. It took a moment for Daniel to realize what she meant. "You're protecting me?" he asked, disbelief coloring his voice. She nodded, a faint smile curling at the corners of her mouth. It wasn't predatory. If anything, it felt reassuring. For the first time, Daniel allowed himself to breathe. Maybe this wasn't a trap after all. Maybe she really was trying to help. But why? And what did she expect in return? As the forest's distant roars echoed into the cavern, Daniel felt a mix of fear and gratitude. He didn't know why this giantess had saved him, but one thing was clear: his survival now depended on her. And if those creatures came for him, she was the only thing standing between him and a gruesome end. But what if she wasn't enough? And what if her kindness came at a cost he wasn't ready to pay? The language barrier. Daniel sat cross-legged on a woven mat, his eyes fixed on the giantess as she drew in the dirt with one of her sharp claws. The symbols were simple yet baffling. Circles, lines, and strange shapes that seemed to form some kind of alien language. She tapped the ground and looked at him expectantly. I don't get it," Daniel said, throwing his hands up. "Is this supposed to be a map? A warning? Directions to the nearest spaceship repair shop?" The giantess huffed, a sound that was almost a laugh, though it carried a note of frustration. She tapped her chest with a finger and then pointed at him. Her glowing eyes seemed to say, "Pay attention, little human." "All right, fine," Daniel muttered, leaning closer. "Let's try this again." He pointed to one of her symbols, a jagged circle with claw-like lines radiating from it. "What's this?" "Danger." The giantess nodded, her silver hair shimmering as she moved. Then she drew a new shape, a large circle with smaller dots inside. She pointed at it, then at the cave walls around them. "This place," Daniel guessed. "The cave." Her nod came quicker this time. Encouraged, Daniel started piecing things together. "Okay, so the cave is safe. But out there," he gestured toward the jagged symbol, "it's dangerous." "Got it." The giantess gave him a faint smile, revealing sharp teeth that still made his stomach flip. But the gesture felt genuine, almost proud. It was like teaching a stubborn child to tie their shoes. Feeling this surge of confidence, Daniel grabbed a stick and started drawing in the dirt beside her. He sketched a crude image of his ship, an oval with spindly legs, and pointed to it. "This is me. My home, I guess." The giantess tilted her head, studying his drawing. Then, to his surprise, she mimicked the motion he'd made earlier when his ship had crashed, a rapid swoop downward with her hand. She let out a soft, melodic sound, as if mimicking the roar of engines. Daniel chuckled despite himself. "Yeah, that's about how it went. One crash landing, served hot." The moment of levity didn't last. The giantess tapped his drawing of the ship and then pointed to the forest outside. Her expression darkened, and she shook her head. Daniel frowned. "You're saying I can't get back to it? Why not?" She drew the jagged danger symbol again, larger this time, and surrounded it with claw-like marks. Then she added a stick figure, small and fragile, like him, and drew lines crossing it out. Daniel swallowed hard. "Oh, so I go back, I die. Got it. Thanks for the vote of confidence." The giantess made a low rumbling sound, half sympathetic, half insistent. She gestured at the spear she crafted earlier, which leaned against the cave wall. Then she tapped her chest and pointed to him, repeating the motion with deliberate care. "You're protecting me," Daniel said slowly, realization dawning. "You want me to stay here, safe. Is that it?" Her nod was firm, almost commanding. But Daniel wasn't sure he could follow that order. His ship had supplies he desperately needed, tools, navigation equipment, maybe even a way to call for help. Staying in the cave forever wasn't an option. Still, the way her glowing eyes bore into him made it clear she wouldn't let him leave without a fight. She might have saved his life, but she wasn't about to let him throw it away. "All right," he said, raising his hands in surrender. "You win. For now." The giantess seemed satisfied, her posture relaxing as she leaned back against the cave wall. But as the silence settled, Daniel found himself growing restless. Who was she, really? Why was she helping him? And what had happened to her people? He'd seen the scars on her arms, the weariness in her eyes. She wasn't just some random creature. She had a story. Gathering his courage, Daniel tapped the ground to get her attention. When she looked at him, he pointed to her chest. "You? Who are you?" The question made her pause. She placed a hand on her chest and said a single word, low, melodic, and resonant. It sounded like Ziara. "Ziara," Daniel repeated, trying to mimic the sound. Her lips twitched into what might have been amusement, but she didn't correct him. She then pointed at him, her glowing eyes curious. "You?" Daniel blinked. "Oh, I'm Daniel." He tapped his chest. "Daniel." "Danielle," she said, her voice rolling over the unfamiliar syllables like a stream over rocks. It wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to make him smile. "Yeah, that's me," he said. "Daniel, the crash survivor." "Nice to meet you, Zara." For the first time, her expression softened into something that looked unmistakably like a smile. It was brief, almost shy, but it was there. And for the first time since landing on this strange planet, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. If they could bridge the gap between their worlds, maybe, just maybe, he had a chance to survive. But as the distant growls of unseen creatures echoed through the forest, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The predators. The forest was alive with a sound Daniel couldn't describe, an eerie symphony of distant growls, rustling leaves, and the occasional shrill cry that sent chills down his spine. He gripped the crude spear Zyra had crafted for him, its rough texture a constant reminder of how ill-prepared he was for what lay ahead. Zyra moved silently ahead of him, her massive form blending into the shadows of the towering alien trees. Despite her size, she navigated the terrain with an elegance that left Daniel in awe. Every step she took seemed deliberate, her glowing eyes scanning the forest with the intensity of a predator. Daniel, on the other hand, felt like prey. "You sure this is a good idea?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the ambient noise. He wasn't sure if she understood him, but she glanced back, her expression unreadable. She pointed to a cluster of glowing plants ahead, their neon green light pulsing like a heartbeat. Daniel crouched next to her as she knelt and inspected the plants. She plucked a few and tucked them into a pouch made of woven vines, then gestured for him to do the same. He hesitated, unsure if he should trust her choice. "You better not be setting me up to eat some alien poison," he muttered, grabbing one of the plants. It felt warm in his hand, its texture like soft rubber. Ziara raised an eyebrow, or at least he thought it was an eyebrow, and gave him a look that screamed, "Do you trust me or not?" Before he could decide, a low growl rippled through the air. This one was closer, deeper, and far more menacing than the sounds they'd heard before. Ziara froze, her glowing eyes narrowing as she scanned the forest. "What was that?" Daniel whispered, his grip tightening on the spear. His question was answered almost immediately. Two glowing eyes appeared in the darkness, followed by a second pair, then a third. The creatures stepped into the faint light of the glowing plants, revealing twisted forms that made Daniel's blood run cold. They were unlike anything he'd ever seen. Hulking beasts with elongated limbs, razor-sharp claws, and mouths filled with rows of jagged teeth. Their black, scaly skin seemed to absorb the light, making them appear as shadows come to life. Daniel stumbled back, his heart racing. "Ziara," he said, his voice shaking. "Tell me you've got a plan." Ziara didn't respond. Instead, she let out a guttural roar that seemed to shake the trees themselves. The beasts paused, their glowing eyes narrowing as they assessed their opponent. For a moment, there was silence. Then, as if on some unspoken command, the creatures charge. Ziara was ready. With a grace that defied her size, she spun the long spear she carried, its crystal tip catching the faint light. She swung it with devastating force, slamming it into the first creature's chest. The beast let out a pained shriek, its body crumpling to the ground. Holy! Daniel barely had time to react before another beast lunged at him. He stumbled backward, raising his own spear in a panic. The creature's claws raked the air inches from his face. "Not today," he shouted, jabbing the spear forward. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. The sharp tip grazed the beast's side, making it howl and retreat. Ziara didn't waste time. She moved like a whirlwind, her spear slicing through the air with deadly precision. For every creature she took down, two more seemed to take its place. The forest was a blur of chaos, snarls, the clash of claws against weapons, and Daniel's panicked breaths as he tried to keep up. One of the creatures broke through Ziara's defense, its glowing eyes locked onto Daniel. He froze, his legs refusing to move. The beast's jaws opened wide, revealing rows of glistening teeth. Then, out of nowhere, Ziara's massive hand shot out, grabbing the creature by the neck. With a feral growl, she slammed it into the ground, the impact shaking the earth. She looked at Daniel, her expression a mix of anger and urgency. Yeah, I get it," he stammered. "Less panicking, more stabbing. Got it." Despite their efforts, the creatures kept coming. It was clear they were outnumbered. Ziara roared again, this time a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate in Daniel's chest. The creatures hesitated, their glowing eyes flickering with what looked like fear. Taking advantage of the moment, Ziara grabbed Daniel and pulled him close. She pointed toward a narrow path winding deeper into the forest, then pushed him in that direction. "You want me to run?" he asked, his voice rising. "What about you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned back to the creatures, her stance defiant as she raised her spear. It was clear she intended to hold them off. "Ziara." "No," Daniel shouted, but she didn't budge. Her glowing eyes met his for a brief moment, filled with an unspoken command. "Go." Reluctantly, Daniel turned and ran, the sounds of battle fading behind him. As he stumbled through the forest, the weight of what had just happened settled over him. Ziara had risked everything to protect him. But why? And what was he supposed to do now? Healing bonds. The flickering light of the glowing plants barely illuminated the cavern as Daniel stumbled in, gasping for air. His chest heaved, his heart pounding against his ribs like a war drum. He dropped the crude spear Ziara had made for him and collapsed against the cool stone wall. "Ziara," he muttered, his voice barely audible. She wasn't behind him. The roaring, the snarling, the sound of crashing trees, it had all faded into the distance. For a moment, Daniel thought he was safe. Then, a deafening thud at the cave's entrance shattered the silence. He scrambled to his feet, his heart leaping into his throat as Ziara appeared, her massive frame silhouetted against the night. But she was hurt. Her usually graceful movements were labored, and deep gashes marred her shimmering gray skin. Black ichor oozed from her wounds, staining the crystalline spear she still gripped tightly. She staggered forward and slumped against the cave wall, her glowing eyes dim. "Ziara," Daniel shouted, rushing to her side. He didn't know what to do. He wasn't a doctor, and her alien biology was a complete mystery to him. But he couldn't just stand there and do nothing. She let out a low, rumbling sound, her head tilted slightly to meet his gaze. Her eyes, though weary, were still fierce, silently telling him, "I'm fine. Don't fuss." "Yeah, you're not fooling anyone," Daniel muttered, kneeling beside her. He grabbed his bag and rummaged through it, pulling out the small emergency medical kit he'd salvaged from his ship. It wasn't much, just a few bandages, antiseptic, and some painkillers, but it would have to do. He hesitated, unsure where to start. "Okay, though. I don't know if this stuff even works on you, but here goes nothing. Carefully, he cleaned one of the gashes on her arm. The black ichor bubbled slightly under the antiseptic, making him wince. "Sorry," he said, glancing up at her. Ziara's expression didn't change, but she let out a soft hum, almost like a purr. It was strange, but it put him at ease. As he worked, Daniel couldn't help but notice the intricate patterns on her skin. Up close, they looked like scars, but there was a deliberate beauty to them, as if they told a story. He wondered what kind of life she'd lived, what battles she'd fought, and why she was here, alone on this hostile planet. "Why'd you save me?" he asked quietly, not expecting an answer. "You don't even know me. I'm just some human who crashed on your turf. You could have let those things have me." Ziara tilted her head, her glowing eyes softening. She tapped her chest, then pointed at him, her expression unreadable. "Because it's the right thing to do," Daniel guessed. She didn't respond, but the faintest smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Okay," he said, focusing back on her wounds. "Guess I owe you one. Or 10. Hours passed as Daniel did what he could to patch her up. The glowing fruit from earlier seemed to accelerate her healing. Once he applied it to her wounds, the ichor slowed, and the gashes began to close. By the time he was done, the cave was silent except for their breathing. Exhausted, Daniel slumped against the wall beside her. "You know," he said, his voice heavy with fatigue, "I'm starting to think you're not as scary as you look." Ziara glanced at him, her eyes narrowing slightly, and let out a soft growl. Daniel chuckled. All right. Still scary. Got it." They sat in silence for a while, the tension from earlier slowly fading. Despite everything, the crash, the predators, the constant danger, Daniel felt safe. It was an odd feeling, considering he was sitting next to a towering alien who could crush him with one hand. But Zara's presence was strangely comforting. "Guess we're stuck with each other now, huh?" he said, glancing at her. She didn't respond, but her glowing eyes met his, and in that moment, Daniel thought he saw something he hadn't expected: trust, and maybe, just maybe, a hint of friendship. But as the night wore on, Daniel's mind drifted back to the forest and the creatures lurking within. Zara had risked her life to protect him, but he knew this wasn't over. Whatever had driven those predators to attack wasn't going away. And now, it wasn't just about survival. It was about finding a way off this planet, and making sure they both lived to see it. The Great Escape. The forest was a battlefield. Daniel crouched behind a cluster of glowing vines, his knuckles white, as he gripped the makeshift spear Ziara had crafted. The distant growls of the predators echoed through the trees, growing louder with each passing moment. Sweat dripped down his face, and his heart pounded like a war drum. They were closing in. Ziara stood a few feet ahead, her massive frame illuminated by the eerie bioluminescence of the alien flora. Her injuries had slowed her, but her determination remained unshaken. She tightened her grip on her crystalline spear, her glowing eyes fixed on the shadows shifting in the distance. "We can't fight them all," Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. "There's too many." Ziara didn't respond. Instead, she reached into a pouch slung across her shoulder and pulled out a shard of glowing crystal. She held it up, the light casting strange patterns across her face, and pointed to the small clearing beyond them. Daniel's stomach dropped. "You want to leave them there? Are you crazy?" Ziara turned, her expression calm but commanding. She tapped his chest, then gestured toward the path behind them, the narrow, winding trail that led back to his ship. Her meaning was clear: you need to go. Now. I'm not leaving you here to die, he hissed, his voice rising despite himself. But Ziara's expression hardened. She tapped her chest and growled low, a sound that reverberated through the air like a warning. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. Before Daniel could argue, a deafening roar tore through the forest. The predators had found them. Glowing eyes appeared in the darkness, dozens of them, moving like a coordinated swarm. Daniel's blood ran cold as the creatures emerged, their black, scaly bodies glistening in the dim light. Ziara moved first. With a roar that shook the trees, she charged into the fray, her spear flashing as it struck the nearest creature. Daniel hesitated, torn between the instinct to run and the urge to fight alongside her. "Damn it, Ziara," he muttered, forcing himself to move. But she was already lost in the chaos, her towering figure surrounded by snapping jaws and slashing claws. Daniel made a decision. He wouldn't leave her behind, not without trying to even the odds. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small device, one of the few salvaged from his wrecked ship. It was a distress beacon, designed to emit a high-frequency signal that could disorient predators. It wasn't meant for a situation like this, but it was all he had. "Let's see if this works," he muttered, pressing the button. The device emitted a piercing screech, a sound so sharp that Daniel had to cover his ears. The predators howled, their movements growing erratic as they recoiled from the noise. Ziara took full advantage of the chaos. She struck with precision, her spear finding its mark again and again. But it was clear she couldn't hold out much longer. Blood, both hers and the creature's, streaked the ground, and her movements were slowing. "Ziara," Daniel shouted, rushing toward her. "We've got to go." She glanced back at him, her glowing eyes filled with both relief and frustration, but there was no time to argue. The creatures were regrouping, shaking off the effects of the beacon. Daniel grabbed her arm, his voice firm. "Come on, you're not dying here." For a moment, he thought she would resist. But then, with a growl of resignation, she turned and followed him. Together, they sprinted toward the clearing, the ground shaking beneath Ziara's massive strides. When they reached the edge of the forest, Daniel's ship came into view. It was battered and smoking, but it was still standing. "Almost there," he shouted, adrenaline fueling his every step. Behind them, the predators roared in fury, their glowing eyes closing the distance. Daniel fumbled with the ship's controls, his hands trembling as he activated the hatch. Come on," he muttered. Ziara pushed him inside, her massive hands surprisingly gentle, and turned to face the approaching swarm. "No," Daniel yelled, grabbing her arm. "You're coming too." The predators were nearly upon them when Ziara finally relented, climbing into the cramped ship. The hatch closed just as the first creature slammed against the exterior, its claws screeching against the metal. Daniel collapsed into the pilot's seat, his chest heaving. "Hold on," he shouted, flipping switches and gripping the controls. The ship sputtered to life, its engines whining in protest. He pushed it as hard as it would go, the ground shaking as the ship lifted off. The predators howled in frustration, their glowing eyes fading into the distance as the ship rose higher and higher. Daniel let out a shaky laugh, relief washing over him. "We made it." Ziara sat on the floor, her massive frame barely fitting in the small space. She let out a low hum, her glowing eyes meeting his. There was exhaustion in her gaze, but also gratitude. For the first time, Daniel saw her smile, faint and fleeting, but real. He leaned back, his hands still shaking. "That was insane," he muttered, glancing at her. "But we did it. We're alive." The ship's radar beeped, pulling his attention to the screen. A signal flickered, a faint transmission from deep space. Daniel frowned. "What the?" Ziara leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. The signal was unfamiliar, yet somehow familiar to her. Daniel glanced at her, his heart sinking. "Something tells me this isn't over." A new beginning. The ship drifted through the vast darkness of space, its battered hull rattling with each passing moment. Daniel sat in the pilot's seat, his eyes fixed on the faint signal blinking on the navigation console. It pulsed like a heartbeat, steady and persistent, pulling them toward an unknown destination. Behind him, Ziara leaned against the wall, her massive frame taking up nearly half the cabin. Her wounds, though still fresh, had mostly closed, thanks to the strange glowing fruit she'd used as a salve. She watched Daniel with quiet intensity, her glowing eyes scanning his every move. "Don't look at me like that," Daniel muttered, glancing over his shoulder. "I don't know what I'm doing any more than you do." Ziara tilted her head, her lips twitching into a faint smirk. It was subtle, but Daniel had spent enough time with her to recognize the gesture. She was amused, and maybe a little impressed. The signal grew stronger, its frequency sharp and insistent. Daniel tapped a few buttons, bringing up a holographic display of the surrounding space. "Okay," he said, narrowing his eyes. "It's coming from there." The display zoomed in on a massive structure orbiting a desolate moon. It was ancient, its surface covered in cracks and overgrown with alien moss. Lights flickered sporadically along its outer edges, like a dying star struggling to hold on. Zara leaned forward, her glowing eyes widening. She let out a low hum, her expression shifting to one of recognition. She pointed at the structure, then at herself. "You know this place?" Daniel asked, his brow furrowing. She nodded, her gaze filled with a mix of longing and apprehension. "Great," Daniel muttered, adjusting their course. "Let's hope this isn't another death trap." The landing was rough, the ship groaning as it touched down on the structure's jagged surface. Daniel stepped out first, gripping the spear Zara had made for him. The air was thin but breathable, filled with the faint scent of decay. Zara followed, her towering form casting a long shadow over the landing pad. The structure's interior was even more unsettling. The walls were covered in ancient carvings, their meanings lost to time. Faint echoes of their footsteps bounced off the high ceilings, creating an eerie symphony of sound. Zara moved with purpose, her glowing eyes scanning the carvings. She ran her fingers along one of the symbols, a jagged spiral that seemed to pulse faintly under her touch. Her expression hardened, and she let out a low growl. "What is it?" Daniel asked, stepping closer. "What does it say?" She pointed to the symbol, then mimicked the motion of a collapsing structure with her hands. Daniel's stomach sank. "It's unstable, isn't it?" Before she could respond, the ground beneath them shook. Dust and debris rained from the ceiling, and a distant rumble echoed through the corridors. "Of course it is," Daniel muttered, gripping the spear tighter. "Why wouldn't it be?" Ziara grabbed his arm and pulled him forward, her strides long and deliberate. She seemed to know where she was going, but Daniel could barely keep up. The rumbling grew louder, the structure trembling as if it were alive. They rounded a corner and entered a massive chamber. At its center was a glowing orb, suspended in midair by a web of energy. Symbols carved into the floor pulsed in rhythm with the orb, casting the chamber in an otherworldly light. Zara froze, her glowing eyes locked on the orb. She let out a soft hum, her expression unreadable. "What is that?" Daniel asked, stepping closer. "Some kind of power source." She didn't answer. Instead, she reached out, her massive hand hovering just inches from the orb. The energy web flickered, reacting to her presence. "Wait," Daniel said, grabbing her arm. "Are you sure about this?" Zara looked down at him, her glowing eyes soft but determined. She placed her free hand on his chest, a gesture that somehow conveyed more than words ever could. "Trust me." Daniel released her arm, his heart pounding as she touched the orb. The chamber filled with blinding light, and for a moment, Daniel thought the entire structure was about to collapse. But then the light faded and the rumbling stopped. When Daniel opened his eyes, the orb was gone. In its place stood Zara, her injuries completely healed. Her eyes glowed brighter than ever, and an aura of power surrounded her. "Okay," Daniel said, his voice shaking. "That was something." Zara turned to him, her expression softer than he'd ever seen it. She reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, her glowing eyes filled with gratitude. Daniel smiled, though his legs felt like jelly. "So, what now?" She pointed toward the structure's exit, where the distant stars shone like a promise of freedom. For the first time, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. They had survived the forest, the predators, and the collapse of this ancient place. Now, it was time to find a new beginning. As they boarded the ship and took off, Daniel couldn't help but glance at Sarah. She was no longer just a protector or a guide. She was a partner, a strange, towering, alien partner, but a partner nonetheless. And as the ship sailed into the unknown, Daniel realized one thing. He wasn't afraid anymore.